The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a hydro bill and a flyer for a pizza place that had already closed down. Liam Beckett almost missed it. He almost threw it in the recycling without looking, the way he did with most things that came in cream-colored envelopes. But something made him stop. Maybe the handwriting on the front, looping and careful the way it always had been, like the person writing it wanted to seem more elegant than they actually were. He stood at the kitchen counter and opened it. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Veronica Ann Shelby and Preston Alistair Wyndham. The date, the venue. A country estate an hour outside Ottawa, the kind of place with stone walls and a long gravel driveway and photos on the wedding website that looked like they'd been styled by someone who charged by the hour." Liam set the invitation down on the counter. Then he picked it up again. Then he set it down again. His daughter Abby came padding into the kitchen in her socks, her hair still flattened from sleep, pulling at the sleeve of her sweater. She was 7 years old and had the unsettling habit of appearing right when he was trying to think. "Who's that from?" she asked, climbing onto the stool at the counter and peering at the envelope. "Nobody," he said. She gave him a look that suggested she did not believe him. Liam Beckett had not spoken to Veronica Shelby in 4 years. The last time he'd seen her, she was standing in the doorway of the apartment they'd shared on Elgin Street, holding a box of her things, and she'd said, very calmly, very reasonably, the way she always said difficult things, that she thought it was better if they stopped, that she loved him but she couldn't keep doing this, that she needed someone who was going somewhere. He had been 31 years old, working 2 jobs, and Abby had been 3. He remembered the box she was holding had a picture of a blender on the side of it, and he'd thought, absurdly, that blender was mine. And then she was gone. What Veronica had meant when she said she needed someone going somewhere was that Liam was going nowhere. He was a former RCMP officer on medical leave after a line-of-duty injury that had left him with a rebuilt knee and a severance package that covered about 4 months of rent. He was working nights at a security firm and days behind the counter at a Canadian Tire in Nepean. And he was raising a 3-year-old by himself because Abby's mother had died when Abby was 11 months old. A car accident on the 417, black ice, nothing dramatic, nothing that made sense, and the whole weight of that had settled into Liam like concrete, slow and permanent. Veronica had not been Abby's mother. She had come into his life about a year after, and she had tried genuinely for a while. But Liam had been a man who came with a lot of gravity, and eventually she had floated away. He didn't blame her. He'd told himself that so many times it had become something close to true. He told his friend Marcus about the invitation. Not the Marcus in his phone, different Marcus. This was Marcus Webb, his neighbor from the building on Rochester, who was retired and spent most afternoons making elaborate sandwiches and watching soccer. Marcus was 63 and had been married to the same woman for 38 years and had no patience for nonsense. "She invited you," Marcus said, not as a question. "She invited me," Liam confirmed, "to watch her marry someone else, at a country estate." Marcus took a bite of his sandwich and chewed for a moment. Why would she do that? Lamb had been asking himself the same thing. The most charitable interpretation was that Veronica wanted closure, some mature adult acknowledgement that they were both fine, that things had worked out for everyone. But Veronica was not especially interested in closure for its own sake. She was interested in narrative, in how things looked, and the narrative of Liam Beckett showing up to her wedding, slightly worn around the edges, still driving the same truck, still working a job that didn't require a business card, and seeing what she had built without him. That narrative had a specific appeal that Liam understood very well. "She wants me to see," he told Marcus. "That's all." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going?" Lamb looked out the window at the street. A maple tree he'd been watching turn color for 4 Octobers now was just starting to go at the edges, orange creeping in from the tips of the leaves. "I haven't decided," he said. That was not entirely true. What Veronica did not know, what almost nobody from that part of his life knew, was what the last 4 years had looked like. After she left, Liam had been sitting at the kitchen table one night after Abby was in bed, going through the numbers, adding them up different ways to see if they got better. They didn't. He'd been paying into a disability insurance plan through the force that he'd never paid much attention to, and he pulled out the policy document and actually read it for the first time. He called the insurance company. He called a lawyer. He spent 3 months in a process that felt like pushing water uphill, and at the end of it, he had a settlement that wasn't life-changing but was enough to stop drowning. He took the money, and he took a course. Not a glamorous one, a certification program in corporate security consulting, the kind of thing taught in a beige classroom in Canada with fluorescent lighting and textbooks that were 3 editions out of date. He studied while Abby slept. He passed every exam on the first try. He got a contract. A small one, a tech company in Gatineau that needed someone to assess their physical security protocols. He did good work. They referred him to someone else. Someone else referred him to someone else. He hired a woman named Claudette Marois to help him with the administrative side of things because he was bad at invoicing and she was ferociously good at it, and within 8 months he had something that could reasonably be called a business. Beckett Security Consulting had grown quietly, the way things grow when nobody is watching. By the time Veronica's invitations arrived in the mail, Liam had a contract with a federal crown corporation, 2 ongoing engagements with private clients whose names appeared regularly in the report on business, and a small team of associates that included 2 former RCMP officers and a woman who had spent 12 years with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He still drove the same truck. He hadn't gotten around to replacing it. He still lived in a house in Westboro that he'd bought 2 years ago, modest by any measure, with a backyard where Abby had planted tomatoes last summer with results that were mixed at best. He didn't have a business card that told you any of this. He didn't particularly want one. He had told almost nobody because there was nobody who needed to know. He decided to go to the wedding. He made the decision the way he made most decisions now, quietly after thinking about it for longer than seemed necessary, then not second-guessing it. He would go because Abby deserved to know that her father was the kind of man who did not shrink from things, and because if he was being honest with himself, and he tried, when possible, to be honest with himself, he was curious. He wanted to look Veronica in the eye and feel nothing in particular. He wanted to know if that was possible yet. He called his associate, a man named Derek Faulkner, who had spent 8 years running close protection details for a private firm before Liam brought him on. Derek was large, calm, and had the kind of face that made people reconsider their choices. Liam told him there was an event on Saturday he'd like company for. Derek said, "Professional capacity." Liam thought about it. "Personal," he said, "but dress like it's professional." Derek said he understood completely. Abby asked the night before if she was coming. Liam was in the kitchen making pasta, which he had gotten quite good at over the years out of necessity, and Abby was doing homework at the table, or doing something adjacent to homework that occasionally involved her pencil touching paper. "No, Bug," he said. "It's a work thing. You said it was a party. It's a work party." She considered this. "Can I stay at Uncle Marcus's, already arranged?" She nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she was doing that was adjacent to homework. Then she looked up again. "Are you going to be okay?" He looked at her. 7 years old, sitting at his kitchen table with a pencil in her hand, asking if he was going to be okay. He thought about Abby's mother sometimes, a woman named Claire, who had been funny and a little reckless and had loved bad horror movies. And he thought that if Claire could see Abby right now, she would have felt something almost unbearable, the good kind. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to be fine." "Okay," Abby said, and went back to her homework. The estate was called Ashbridge Park, which Liam thought sounded like somewhere a minor character in a Victorian novel would go to recover from a mysterious illness. It was exactly as the wedding website had suggested: stone walls, a long gravel driveway lined with lights, tents erected on a sprawling lawn, and the kind of floral arrangements that required a structural engineer. Liam arrived in a black SUV that belonged to his firm, which he almost never used because it felt ostentatious, but which Derek had pointed out was appropriate for the occasion. Derek drove. Liam sat in the back for approximately 30 seconds before moving to the front because sitting in the back of a car while someone else drove felt strange to him, even now. There were perhaps 200 guests on the lawn and a receiving line that snaked around the side of the house. People were dressed well. There was champagne on trays being carried by people in white shirts. A string quartet was playing something tasteful near the entrance. Liam got out of the SUV. Derek came around from the driver's side. They were met at the edge of the gravel by 2 other members of the team, a woman named Josephine, who had a background in threat assessment, and a man named Roland, who was currently the most quietly intimidating person Liam knew. It had not been a coordinated plan, exactly. He had mentioned the event to Derek, and Derek had mentioned it to Josephine, and at some point it had become 4 people instead of 1. Liam had not discouraged it. He walked up the gravel path toward the gathering, and people noticed the way people always noticed when a group moves with purpose and doesn't make eye contact with anyone in particular. A few guests shifted. Someone near the entrance turned to look. He saw Veronica before she saw him. She was standing near the entrance to the main tent, wearing a dress that had clearly taken considerable planning, her hair arranged in the way she'd always arranged it for important occasions. And she was laughing at something the woman beside her had said. She looked beautiful and deliberate, the way Veronica always looked when she'd put considerable effort into seeming effortless. Then she looked up. The expression that crossed Veronica's face was something Liam had not expected and could not have entirely predicted. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to recalibration, the look of a person who had done the math and suddenly realized the math was wrong. She crossed the lawn toward him. Behind her, he could see Preston Wyndham, her fiancé, watching with a pleasant, uncertain smile that seemed to be his default expression in photographs. Preston was a financial advisor with a firm in downtown Ottawa, well-dressed, square-jawed, the kind of man who got described as solid. Liam, Veronica said, stopping a few feet from him. Her eyes moved briefly to Derek, to Josephine, to Roland. Back to Liam. You came. You invited me, he said. I did. She said it slowly, as if confirming something to herself. I didn't think you would. Here I am. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds and contained approximately a decade's worth of subtext. Then Veronica said carefully, You look well. Thank you, Liam said. So do you. Congratulations. She introduced him to Preston, who shook his hand with the firmness of a man who had been taught that a firm handshake was important. Liam was polite. He asked how they'd met. He listened to the answer. He said something appropriate. Preston seemed reassured. Veronica did not. He found a seat near the back of the tent, which he preferred anyway. Derek positioned himself near the entrance and appeared to be studying the tent structure with professional interest. Josephine had wandered toward the canapé table in a way that did not look like surveillance, but was. Roland was somewhere outside. Liam wasn't entirely sure where, which was usually where Roland worked best. The ceremony was beautiful and brief. Veronica cried at the right moments. Preston recited his vows with evident sincerity. The officiant made a joke that landed reasonably well. The string quartet played something during the signing of the register. Liam watched the whole thing and felt mostly a kind of settled quietness. Not emptiness, not grief, just the absence of the thing he'd been carrying for 4 years without entirely realizing it. The ceremony was not about him in any way, and that fact, sitting with it, turned out to be a relief. He thought about Abby at Marcus's, probably eating too many crackers and staying up past her bedtime watching something Marcus had put on. He thought about the drive home, stopping at Tim Hortons the way he always did when he'd been somewhere that required him to be dressed up, changing out of the jacket the moment he got home. He thought, I'm going to be fine, and for the first time in a while, he thought it without having to work at it. The reception was where things unraveled. Not for Liam, for someone else entirely. The speeches had concluded. The first dance had been danced. People were moving between tables and the bar with the ease of guests who'd had enough champagne to feel warm but not enough to be a problem. Liam was near the exit, nursing a sparkling water, thinking about when would be an appropriate time to leave when he saw the 2 men. He noticed them not because they were doing anything visible. He noticed them the way he'd been trained to notice things. A posture that didn't match the occasion. A way of scanning the room that wasn't social. One was near the bar. One was near the entrance that led to the estate's main house. They weren't talking to each other. They didn't need to. He caught Derek's eye across the tent. Derek had seen them too. Liam was not naive about why people might bring that kind of security to a private event. He'd done enough consulting to know that when someone brought that kind of security to a wedding reception, it usually meant they had something that needed protecting, and it wasn't the wedding gifts. He had been doing preliminary diligence on a new client referral 2 weeks prior, and he'd come across a name, Preston Wyndham. Not because Preston was the referral, but because Preston's firm appeared in a document adjacent to the referral, flagged in a financial regulatory context that had not yet become public. Liam had noted it and set it aside. It wasn't his file. He looked at the man standing near the bar. He looked at the man near the house entrance. Then the doors to the main tent opened, and they were no longer 2 men in an ambiguous capacity. There were 6 of them, and 2 were RCMP in dress clothes, carrying credentials, and the other 4 were financial crimes investigators from the Fintrack Enforcement Division. Liam recognized one of them, a woman named Andrea Bouchard, who had been 3 years ahead of him at Depot, who he had not seen since a retirement party in 2019. She saw him at the same moment. The look on her face said of all the wedding receptions in all the country estates in all of Ontario. What happened next happened the way these things always happen at the worst possible moment, with devastating efficiency and a complete indifference to the occasion. Preston Wyndham was approached. Credentials were presented. There was a brief conversation, very low, and then Preston's pleasant, uncertain expression became something else entirely. Something that had been underneath the pleasant uncertainty all along. Veronica stood 12 feet away and watched the man she had married 45 minutes ago be escorted toward the entrance of the tent by federal investigators. The string quartet had stopped playing. Liam did not stay. He found Andrea near the entrance and they spoke for 4 minutes, quietly, efficiently, the way two people speak when they have a shared professional language and a situation that doesn't benefit from elaboration. She told him what she could. He told her what he'd seen in the document 2 weeks ago. She said they'd be in touch, and he said of course. He walked back through the tent. 200 guests were standing or sitting, with the particular stillness of people who have witnessed something they don't fully understand yet. Someone was crying softly near the floral centerpiece. Someone else was on their phone. Veronica was standing where she had been standing. She was very still. The elaborate updo was exactly as it had been an hour ago. The dress was perfect. Everything on the outside was exactly as she had planned it. She looked at Liam as he passed. He stopped. He didn't plan what he said. It came from somewhere he didn't examine too closely. "I'm sorry," he said. "I mean that. This isn't what you deserved." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Were you the one who—" "No," he said. "This had nothing to do with me." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he could see very clearly that she understood. Not just about Preston, about the men with Liam, about the gap between what she had assumed about his life and what his life actually was. "Liam," she said. "Take care of yourself, Veronica," he said. And he walked out. The drive back was quiet. Derek drove without asking questions, which Liam appreciated, because Derek was good at understanding which situations called for silence. The highway was clear, a late October Saturday night, the kind of cold that made the stars sharper, the kind of dark that made the city lights seem further away than they were. Liam's phone buzzed somewhere around Smith's Falls. It was Marcus. The text said, "She's asleep. Ate half a sleeve of crackers. You okay?" He typed back, "Yeah, be there in an hour." He looked out the window at the highway. At the dark fields on either side, the occasional farmhouse with a light on in the window, the way the road narrowed, and then opened again as they crested a small hill. He thought about the last 4 years. The nights at the counter at Canadian Tire, coming home exhausted to a small apartment where a toddler was asleep in the next room. The insurance documents, the beige classroom in Canada, the first contract, the second contract, the morning he'd looked at his bank statement and realized he no longer needed to add the numbers up differently to make them better. None of it had felt like triumph at the time. It had just felt like the next thing, and then the next thing after that. You didn't always get to feel the distance you'd traveled until something made you look back. He thought about Veronica standing in that tent in her perfect dress with her perfect updo, watching everything she'd chosen come apart at the seams. He didn't feel satisfaction. He'd expected maybe to feel some, a small, human, understandable amount. But what he felt was closer to sadness. She had made choices based on what she thought she knew, and what she thought she knew had been wrong, and now she was standing in the ruins of a version of her life that had never quite been real. That could happen to anyone. That had almost happened to him. He picked up Abby just before midnight. She was on Marcus's couch under a blue blanket, deeply asleep, one arm flung over the edge. Liam stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. Marcus was in the armchair with a cup of tea, watching the tail end of whatever sport was on with the volume low. He looked at Liam and raised an eyebrow. "Eventful?" Marcus asked. "A little," Liam said. "You okay?" "Yeah." Liam crouched down beside the couch and gently repositioned Abby's arm so it wasn't hanging off the edge. She stirred, not quite waking. "I think I actually am." He carried her to the truck carefully, the way he'd been carrying her since she was 11 months old, the weight of her settling against his shoulder with the absolute trust of a sleeping child. She smelled like crackers and the lavender shampoo she'd decided she liked this year, and something else he couldn't identify that was just her. He buckled her in. She settled into the seat and didn't wake up. He drove home through the quiet Ottawa streets, the canal dark and still on his left, the Gatineau Hills faint against the sky ahead, the city doing what it did on late October nights, which was exist calmly and without drama, the way things exist when they're well established and not trying to prove anything. He pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, sat for a moment in the silence. The maple in the front yard had gone fully orange since the morning. In the dark, he couldn't see it properly, but he knew it was there, and he knew that in a week or two the leaves would be down and it would be bare. And then it would snow, and then eventually, this being Canada, this being the particular patient arithmetic of the seasons, it would come back green in the spring, the way it always did. He got out of the truck. He lifted Abby from the back seat. He carried her up the front walk, unlocked the door, and brought her inside. The house was warm and quiet. The kitchen light he'd left on cast a small yellow pool on the counter. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. Liam Beckett put his daughter to bed, took off his jacket, and made himself a cup of tea. He sat at the kitchen table for a little while in the quiet, not thinking about anything in particular. Then he went to bed. Outside, the maples stood in the dark, and the October cold settled over the street, and somewhere on the other side of the city, a woman named Veronica was working out what came next. And here, in this house, in this neighborhood, in this ordinary life that had taken 4 hard years to build, nothing was missing. Nothing needed to be different. Everything that mattered was already inside.